The UN General Assembly is infamous for annually adopting between 60 to 20 resolutions condemning Israel. Again, I thank Hillel Neuer for his reporting on this. But an average of 12 country-specific resolutions on the rest of the world combined. That's incredible. One of the worst was in 1975 when UNRWA, the UN General Assembly, Resolution 3246, addressed the Palestinians and, quote, and I quote it, reaffirms the legitimacy of the people's struggle for liberation from alien subjugation by all available means, including armed struggle. That was from the UN. This was written to legitimize Palestinian terrorism and Hamas and other terrorist organizations, and they do it regularly, and it's cited regularly. It must be repealed, just as Zionism is racism resolution was repealed. And I remind members, and we went through this when we were on the floor discussing Hamas, read the Hamas Charter of 1988. Clearly, it talks about openly, aggressively killing Jews. It says Israel has no right to exist and needs to be eviscerated from the face of the earth. It's right there in black and white, and they're doing it. Why are we surprised? The UN Security Council has been, since October 7th, unwilling to condemn Hamas or to acknowledge Israel's right to self-defense. And we all remember, because again, I was here, when Yasser Arafat couldn't even come here because he refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. He gave them some very, very weak statement and then was allowed to come to the United Nations. But that Israel's right to exist has still not been accepted by so many at the UN. The UN Secretary General has done even worse, saying Hamas's atrocities did not happen in a vacuum, and then pointing to 56 years of suffocating occupation. Secretary General Antonio Guterres claimed he was not justifying Hamas, but in fact he is relativizing and excusing them. Thankfully, Israel has an ambassador to the UN, Gilead Erdan, who had the strength of character to call out the Secretary General. I would note, parenthetically, he was scheduled to be here today. He will come at a future hearing, but the situation in New York required his presence there and could not make it. The relevant context for understanding Hamas's genocide atrocities is provided by the UN itself and its persistent, morally bankrupt policy of promoting anti-Semitic grievances and justifying anti-Semitic violence. Finally, there is a web of bodies dedicated solely to harming Israel. I mentioned one a moment ago with Ms. Albanese and her statements. The Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the Palestinian people. The Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. They are funded by the General Assembly, which means we're funding them, and function solely as propaganda channels for anti-Semitism, grievances, and maligning Israel. There is no similar committee on any other country in the world. So again, I want to thank you. I'd like to yield to my very distinguished and good friend, Ms. Wild, for any opening comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am glad we're having this hearing. I thank all of you for being here, particularly the witnesses for taking time and the people who are here to give witness to this hearing and the substance of it. As we know, this is an incredibly difficult time for so many people across our nation, across the world, and in my own community in Pennsylvania. And that includes Jews, Muslims, Arab Americans of different faiths, people of other faiths, and all of those who have been overcome by grief since October 7th and over the subsequent weeks. I think we are all in a period of collective mourning to some extent or another. And let me first say, may we all think of the 240 hostages and work for their release as soon as possible. That must be foremost in all of our minds. We cannot find the words to express our grief, and far too often we find ourselves divided in our pain rather than united in our common humanity. As a Jew myself, I value the existence of the state of Israel, and I condemn all forms of anti-Semitism. But time and again, I have said to my many constituents of many different faiths that no human life is worth more than any other to me. I hold in my heart every life that hangs in the balance, and I'm ready to work with anyone to make any degree of progress in addressing this devastating crisis. We all need to work together to bring about a peaceful existence and a place to live for everyone. But sadly, this is a time of war, and I will say, parenthetically, I reject any claim that Israel caused or instigated this war. Having said that, while this hearing will shine a light on many issues and challenges that the United States and the United Nations face to improve the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, colloquially known as UNRWA, we also need to recognize that UNRWA and other partners are working to deliver essential humanitarian aid to meet the emergency needs of innocent civilians in Gaza. We know that the humanitarian needs are only going to rise, and we must be cognizant that UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, and that without UNRWA, assistance simply cannot be delivered. Right now, UNRWA is working and coordinating responses with other excellent agencies like World Food Program, an agency that I am very familiar with, have seen up close and personal in other countries, and am very impressed by, and to ensure that civilians are able to receive critical humanitarian assistance consisting of food, water, shelter, and medical care. And I think we all know that the humanitarian crisis is huge. It's not being completely addressed by any means. It may not even be possible to completely address the humanitarian crisis that is happening there. But we must try, UNRWA must try, and its partner organizations. So in this challenging moment, when it's really hard to feel any kind of hope for the future, we have a responsibility, I feel, for the sake of future generations, to engage in robust, proactive diplomacy on the international stage. That means working to strengthen and improve agencies, including UNRWA and the UN system, across the board, not walking away from our international commitments. And together, I feel that we must find a way forward. And so I look forward to this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Berg. Okay. Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Wild, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership as the co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, which met yesterday, and all of your efforts over many years to bring important focus and attention to this fight. And thank you, Representative Wild, for bringing the issue of the hostages front and center to this hearing. As you know, we've been meeting with hostage families for the last 3 weeks, and much like the stories of Holocaust survivors, each story of a hostage family is unique, each story is heartbreaking, and we must continue to do everything we can to bring the hostages home. Anti-Semitism is on the rise here in the US and around the world, and we must stand up to anti-Semitism in all of its forms. As ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt said yesterday, before the Hamas attack on Israel, anti-Semitism was at a crisis level. Since that horrific Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th, anti-Semitism is a catastrophe. There is no question that certain UN member states, bodies, and the General Assembly have a negative, disproportionate focus on Israel and routinely support singling it out more than any other country in the world. This single-minded negative focus on Israel undermines the credibility of the UN, and it distracts from serious challenges facing the world. One-sided UN resolutions do not advance peace. They single out one side of the conflict for blame, while encouraging the other side to reject direct negotiations in favor of a unilateral strategy. It also removes any sense of agency or responsibility from one side, and that removes the incentive to work assiduously toward peace. A lasting peace agreement will only come from direct negotiations from two sides. It cannot be imposed by an international organization such as the United Nations. I'm glad that the United States has regularly vetoed biased and one-sided resolutions at the UN, including a recent UN Security Council resolution on the situation in the Middle East, which failed to mention Israel's right of self-defense. And in response to the recent absurdity that a country that slaughters girls and women for failing to wear their headscarves properly, Iran, would chair the United Nations Human Rights Council Social Forum, the U.S. has rightly boycotted this two-day meeting. My colleagues and I have also long raised concerns about the problematic content in textbooks used by UNRWA schools in the West Bank and Gaza, where biased and discriminatory curriculum is determined by the host government. We will continue to insist that this content be removed. At the same time, many UN agencies provide essential services, such as vaccines for children and other critical services around the world, including in countries where neither the host government nor any alternative can or will provide those services. The UN General Assembly last year approved an Israeli-sponsored resolution condemning Holocaust denial, and agencies like UNESCO support Holocaust education and programs to counter anti-Semitism, which we can agree are important and worthwhile. UN agencies are imperfect, and in certain cases they are even seriously flawed. At the same time, the United States tends to have more influence when we have a seat at the table. So I'm looking forward to hearing what we can do to push for reform, to fix the flaws, and ensure that intolerance, incitement, and bias against Israel, the Jewish people, or any people will not be permitted. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Dr. Barr?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. This is a challenging time in the world right now, and I've been to Israel twice in the last few months. This past summer, been to Surat, have had lunch at some of the kibbutzes in the past that were attacked. For those of us that believe in Israel's right to exist, for those of us that believe in Israel's right to defend itself, but also firmly believe in a two-state solution and as the only path to peace and stability, it seems so far away today. I talked to one of my Palestinian constituents last week who's lost relatives and friends in Gaza. I hear the same anguish and pain that I heard after October 7th in my Jewish constituents, in their deep grief and deep loss. And that's the tragedy here. Israel has a right to prosecute a war against Hamas. They were attacked and they have a right to defend themselves. They have a right to make sure this never happens again. They have a right to dismember, dismantle, and to the best extent eliminate Hamas. But when you see tragic loss of innocent civilian life, you also feel that pain. And I do support President Biden's call for a humanitarian pause to get food, water, medicine into civilians that need that. Again, that's not talking against Israel's right to defend itself. That's not talking about it against Israel's right to exist. That is the American position, and we'll firmly support that position. But when you think about a two-state solution, when you think about a future, is a future ever possible at this particular point in time where Palestinians and Israelis can live side by side? We've got to try to hold on to that possibility. Otherwise, I fear, my Israeli friends will never be able to live in peace, and certainly, I don't know what occupation looks like in Gaza. I worry about that. So, challenging time. We will stand with Israel, but this is a time where I would hope Arab nations and others around the world work with us to find peace, find a path forward where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side, but again, a place where Israelis can feel comfortable that the heinous attacks of October 7th will never happen again. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Schanzer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for having this hearing. Let me in advance thank the witnesses, not just for your testimony today, which I've perused and I know will be informative, but for your work, long work in addressing the issues we face, in particular, Mr. Neuer, your work on the UN and the long historic bias we've seen. Grateful for all of you for being here. We were able to host last month. We were visited by Erwin Kotler, another strong voice from Canada, and he talked about the attack on October 7th. It's insufficient to call it an attack. The massacre, the invasion into Israel of thousands of terrorists seeking to kill, torture, rape, kidnap innocent people with the declared intention of the destruction of the state of Israel and the murder of Jews. And I may not get the words exactly right, but the idea he shared is that what happened on October 7th is incomprehensible. You try to watch the videos, by the way, taken by the attackers, and it's impossible. He said it was incomprehensible, but it was not impossible because we saw it happen. We know what happened. And we look at the response from the United Nations, and the tragedy is it's not incomprehensible. It's totally expected. It's what they've been doing for literally decades. And I think that's what we're here to talk about today. And specifically, when we talk about UNRWA, with, I think, everyone on this panel, I've had the privilege of visiting Israel at different times. Ms. Manning and I had the chance to talk to young students in Ramallah. Students who shared the dreams that our kids have in the United States, that the kids in Israel have, wanted to be doctors and engineers and scientists and change the world for the better. And then the question was asked of them, what do you think of the Israelis? And their answer, tone, and view changed completely. And they began to describe to us the very things we see and know are being taught in the schools, in the UNRWA schools. The education of our kids is the most important thing that we do. It not only determines their prospects for success as adults, it determines the prospects in the future of the country educating those children. Decades of educating children to hate is how you achieve a situation like October 7th, when people literally kill children in front of their parents, kill parents in front of their children, literally burn people alive. And that's why I think the conversation we're about to have today is so important. The need for peace is greater today than it's ever been. The challenge for peace in the immediate moment seems all but impossible. But the importance to have the conversations today, when it comes to the time for questions, I'm going to ask you, why are there refugee camps in Gaza after 75 years? We'll talk about that. It doesn't make any sense. But imagine after this war is over, after Gaza is free from the control of Hamas, a genocidal, nihilistic terrorist organization seeking the destruction of Israel, when the Gazans are free to rebuild their society and their community, and instead of tunnels and terrorist cells, they're building a shiny city like Doha or Abu Dhabi, giving their kids the prospects of a future, like I said, we all want for all of our children. That's what we need to see. And with respect to the calls of a ceasefire, if you watch the news today, Israel has encircled Gaza City, has taken control from Hamas from the perimeter. And what's the first thing that happens? The first thing that happens is Israel allows civilians to flee to safety in the south. Why are they fleeing now? They're fleeing now because they're able to. They didn't flee before because Hamas prohibited it. And that's what we need people to see. So I hold the dream for the future. I continue to pray for the safety of all the civilians. I will say that those who were silent on October 7th, their silence then drowns out any protest they may have today. We have to be clear in our condemnation of what Hamas did, and our focus on a peaceful future, but it cannot happen until Hamas is defeated. I yield back.
Thank you so very much. Without objection, testimony that is being submitted for the record by Duvi Honig, who is the founder and CEO of the Orthodox Jewish Chamber of Commerce, will be made a part of the record. And also testimony by Debbie Soffin, who has been provided me and my staff for years information on UNRWA, and I thank her for that, will be made a part of the record as well. And I do want to recognize Marcus Sheff, who's here from Impact SC. We look forward to your testimony in a future hearing, because I've read your reports. They're very, very incisive, and I thank you for it. And we did invite Deborah Lipstadt, who is our ambassador at large, and she had a genuine conflict of interest and couldn't be here, so the invitation is open, and I know she'll avail herself of it and will come at our very next hearing, which will be very, very soon. So I'd like to introduce Hillel Neuer, who's the executive director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO in Geneva, Switzerland. He is also international lawyer, diplomat, writer, and activist. He has testified often before the United Nations and the United States Senate and the House. Mr. Neuer taught international human rights at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and served as vice president of the NGO Special Committee on Human Rights in Geneva. He is frequently quoted as an expert, and sure he is. I read his website all the time, on the United Nations and human rights by leading newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, Telegraph, Le Monde, New York Times, and has appeared in debates on CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. Without objection, his full bio and all of our witnesses will be made a part of the record. And then we'll hear from Jonathan Schanzer, who is Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he oversees the work of the organization's experts and scholars. He is also on leadership team of FTD's Center on Economic and Financial Power, a project on the use of financial and economic power as a tool of statecraft. Jonathan previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he played an integral role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. He has held previous think tank research positions at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and Middle East Forum. He has written hundreds of articles on the Middle East. We'll then hear from Jonathan Lincoln, who is the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization. Prior to joining CJC, he worked with the United Nations in a variety of capacities since 2005. Most recently, Jonathan served as the Senior Coordination Officer for the UN Special Coordinator's Office, based in Jerusalem, working on the coordination of UN and international development assistance to Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Previously, from 2012 until 2017, he was Senior Political Officer at the UN's Department of Political Affairs in New York, where he covered political developments in North Africa and supported UN interventions in Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and Western Sahara. Mr. Neuer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. I've come here from Geneva, from the headquarters of the United Nations Human Rights Council, to report to you on how that and other key UN bodies, as well as high UN officials, are engaged in the systematic demonization of Israel, even in the aftermath of last month's massacre by Hamas. Mr. Chairman, the United Nations was founded in wake of the Nazi atrocities. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was created in response to barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. 1 month ago, on October 7th, Hamas sent thousands of terrorists to infiltrate into Israel. They broke into more than a dozen communities, massacred entire families, committing horrific and sadistic acts. They slaughtered 260 young people at a music festival. On that day in total, Hamas murdered more than 1,400 people. There are moments in this life, said President Joe Biden, when pure, unadulterated evil is unleashed on this world. The people of Israel lived through one such moment this weekend. This was an act of sheer evil, quote unquote. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak likewise said, the attacks in Israel shocked the world. Over 1,400 people murdered one by one. The elderly, men, women, children, babies in arms, murdered, mutilated, burned alive. We should call it by its name. It was a pogrom. Mr. Chairman, what one would expect the United Nations, likewise, to speak clearly and denounce barbarous acts which have shocked the conscience of mankind. Yet, this is not what has been happening. Instead, over the past month, Despite some condemnations of Hamas, the overwhelming majority of statements by UN bodies and officials have been pointing the finger at Israel, expressly or by implication. The most excited and emotive declarations by the UN's highest officials describing suffering in Gaza are directed at Israel. Never does the UN blame Hamas for launching the war, for embedding themselves inside hospitals, homes, schools, and mosques. There are almost no such posts about the massacre of October 7th, about millions of Israelis subjected even now to rocket attacks, hundreds of thousands of Israelis displaced, more than 200 hostages being held by Hamas. All of these are not being championed in the UN's dramatic social media and statements. The target is always Israel. Now, often this is done by misrepresenting basic facts, such as falsely accusing Israel of bombing a hospital when the culprit was actually the Islamic Jihad, falsely characterizing Israel's legitimate self-defense aimed at targeting terrorists as, quote, collective punishment or other crimes, creating false moral equivalence between such self-defense and the terrorists, misusing numbers of Gaza dead, not telling us the source of the data is Hamas, not telling us how many of those dead are terrorists, including those killed in Israel, and pretending that proportionality is about comparing death tolls when in fact it's about using proportional means to achieve a valid military objective. Now, the UN Charter guarantees the equal rights of nations large and small, yet nowhere is this principle more violated than when it comes to the UN's treatment of Israel. At the UN General Assembly last year, there was one resolution on Iran, one on Syria, one on North Korea, and 15 on Israel. 0 resolutions were adopted on China, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and 180 other countries. At the UNGA, any resolution targeting Israel is passed by an automatic majority. This was on display 2 weeks ago when the GA adopted an Arab-drafted resolution calling for a ceasefire after outrageously they rejected a Canadian amendment that would have condemned Hamas for the massacre and demanded the release of over 200 Israeli hostages, including children, babies, and elderly grandmothers. So the text adopted by the GA failed to even mention the word Hamas, failed to recognize Israel's right and duty to defend its citizens against terrorism. Now, at the World Health Organization, every year its annual assembly deviates from global public health for a special debate singling out Israel. There is no such focus on Syria, where hospitals are repeatedly bombed by Syrian and Russian forces, nor on North Korea, one of the worst health systems in the world. On the contrary, the WHO recently elected North Korea to its executive board. Since the Hamas massacre, the vast majority of statements by the WHO have targeted Israel. Hamas is seldom mentioned. The director, Dr. Tedros, is posting numerous statements falsely implying that Israel targets hospitals. He fails to say that Israel's military abides by the law of armed conflict, expends enormous efforts to avoid harming civilians, while Hamas's strategy, on the contrary, is to embed itself inside hospitals, homes, schools, and mosques to use Gaza civilians as human shields. So on October 17th, Dr. Tedros rushed to quote on Twitter to strongly condemn the attack on Al-Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza. Early reports indicate hundreds of deaths and injuries, he wrote. He called for Israel's evacuation order to be reversed in that area, and he ended with the hashtag not a target. Now, in truth, Israel never targeted or even attacked that hospital, and there were no hundreds killed. The US, France, Britain, and Canada all confirmed Israel's analysis showing the explosion was caused by a failed rocket launch by Islamic Jihad. Dr. Tedros never corrected his false accusation, never deleted his tweet. Likewise, 2 days ago, he posted a call for a ceasefire without any mention of the word Hamas. Israel's right to self-defense, to stop Hamas from carrying out their stated intentions by one of their top officials to repeat the massacre of October 7th was nowhere mentioned. At the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's serial abusers get a free pass. Many sit on the council, including Qatar, Kazakhstan, and Pakistan. Last month, they re-elected the regimes of China and Cuba. None has ever been censured. Last week, when the Human Rights Council opened its social forum, the chair was the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, while dictators are honored, a democracy is scapegoated. The only country in the world with a standing agenda item at the Council is not China, which denies basic human rights to 1.5 billion people, as you well know, Mr. Chairman, nor is it Iran, which beats, blinds, and poisons women and girls for protesting, and which sponsors Hamas terrorism. Instead, the agenda item is on Israel. From the Council's creation until today, it's adopted more resolutions on Israel than on Iran, Syria, and North Korea combined. In May 2021, after Hamas and the Jihad fired 4,000 rockets at Israeli civilian centers, they created at the Council a commission of inquiry targeting Israel. It's the first that has no end date. It is mandated to report in perpetuity. Its unprecedented scope includes a mandate to examine root causes of the conflict, which include alleged systematic discrimination based on race. As chair of the inquiry, the Council appointed Navi Pillay, someone who has signed petitions lobbying governments to, quote, sanction apartheid Israel. She's the chair. UN Watch has documented her bias in a legal request that we submitted to Ms. Pillay, demanding that she recuse herself. She ignored our petition. Another commissioner is Milun Kotari. Last year, he gave an interview where he ranted about the Jewish lobby and questioned Israel's right to be a member of the UN. He was condemned by numerous countries and even UN officials for anti-Semitism, yet he remains in his post. Not surprisingly, in the inquiry's most recent press statement on October 16th, they create a false moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, refusing to treat Hamas as a terrorist organization, refusing to affirm Israel's right to self-defense. In a recent Al Jazeera interview, Navi Pillay effectively explained away Hamas's atrocities as somehow inevitable, and she made false comparisons with Nelson Mandela. Now, other officials need to be examined. Last year, the Council named Francesca Albanese as its special rapporteur on Palestine. The mandate is to investigate only Israel's violations. UN experts are obliged to be objective. Before she was appointed, I informed the Council that Albanese has repeatedly equating the suffering of Palestinians with the Nazi Holocaust and accused Israel of war crimes, apartheid, and genocide. In a 2014 Facebook post, she said America is, quote, subjugated by the Jewish lobby. Still, the Council went ahead and appointed her. Ever since, Albanese has used her UN post to legitimize terrorism. Last November, she addressed a Hamas conference where she said, quote, you have a right to resist. This is a UN human rights expert encouraging Hamas last November. 6 days ago, she led 6 other supposed UN experts to accuse Israel of attempting, quote, genocide. This insane charge was also made a few days prior by Craig Mohiber, the outgoing head of the UN Human Rights Office in New York, in a manifesto that he published as an open letter to the UN, where he implied he was quitting as an act of conscience. Now, this supposed moral protest was covered immediately by The Guardian and Al Jazeera. What they did not report was that Mr. Mohiber actually had to leave his job now, that he was under an investigation since March after we exposed his litany of social media posts describing Israel in terms of infinite evil. Finally, we need to address UNRWA, which in 2022 alone received $344 million in U.S. funding. Under the slogan, peace starts here, UNRWA tells donor states that they educate Palestinians about human rights and peace, that they promote stability. Yet today we've released a new report, Hate Starts Here, how UNRWA teachers indoctrinate Palestinian children and incite anti-Semitism. It can be found at unwatch.org. Our last report documented how UNRWA staff regularly call to murder Jews and create teaching materials that glorify terrorism, encourage martyrdom, demonize Israelis, and incite anti-Semitism. We had identified over 100 UNRWA teachers and staff found to promote hate and violence in social media. Our new report today examines how UNRWA staff reacted to the Hamas massacre. As soon as news of the slaughter broke, they immediately celebrated it on Facebook. Allah is great, Allah is great. Reality surpasses our wildest dreams, posted UNRWA Gaza teacher Osama Ahmed. UNRWA principal Iman Hassan justified the massacre as restoring rights and redressing grievances. Rawia Hellis, director of UNRWA's Khan Yunis training center, featured in an UNRWA video, glorified one of the terrorists as a hero and a prince. UNRWA English teacher Asma Rafiq Kuhel called to sculpture the date, adding the emoji of a heart. UNRWA school administrator Hamada Ahmed posted, welcome to the Great October. Finally, there's an UNRWA official, Mohammed Al-Sheikh Ali. He features on our report on page 16. He recently posted the following: anyone who talks about taking refuge in Sinai is a traitor. Anyone who tries to flee to the south should be treated the way we ought to treat traitors. Mr. Chairman, in other words, we have someone identifying himself on Facebook as an UNRWA official with prominent photos of him receiving UNRWA awards, calling on Hamas to execute Gazans who want to go south to flee for safety to get away from Hamas. In closing, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, key bodies and officials of the United Nations are exploiting and distorting the language, of human rights, the basic concepts of international law. In order to cast Israel as a racist and genocidal state, as the manifestation of infinite evil, even as it is trying to defend itself from one of the most horrific mass terrorist attacks of our time. At a moment when the world needs moral clarity and leadership, the UN has failed. Its actions only incentivize Hamas to continue their strategy of using Palestinians as human shields and maximizing casualties. The United Nations will never live up to its founding premise so long as this pathology endures. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Neuer, for that testimony. Dr. Schanzer?
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Weil, distinguished members of the subcommittee, on behalf of FDD, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I want to thank my fellow panelists here as well for their leadership. Okay. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to testify. The UN's anti-Israel bias, as you just heard, is out of control. It's not just a problem of anti-Semitism, and it hasn't just diverted resources from other serious problems around the world. It has created the conditions for a regional war that is now threatening the Middle East. In other words, the UN has actually undermined its own mission of protecting the rules-based international order. In my written testimony, I take aim at several UN organizations that waste taxpayer funds or exhibit a demented obsession with Israel, but no organization exemplifies the UN's failures better than the UN Relief and Works Agency, otherwise known as UNRWA. The agency was originally created to assist Palestinians displaced by the 1948 war that the Arab states waged against Israel and subsequently lost. From early on, however, it was clear that UNRWA viewed the Palestinians as clients. They refused to permanently resettle them, and then they became the rationale for additional funding year after year. Over time, UNRWA's clients grew old and passed on, but that was bad for business. So UNRWA expanded the definition of Palestinian refugees to include the descendants of refugees. So as a result, UNRWA's registry has ballooned from 700,000 in 1948 to 5.9 million today. Mathematically impossible. Despite the fact that only few of the original refugees are alive today, UNRWA's roster continues to grow, and all of them claim the so-called right of return to lands inside Israel. In other words, UNRWA has extended the Palestinian-Israeli conflict deliberately and indefinitely. UNRWA today also identifies 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank as refugees. I'll remind you, these are people living in the Palestinian territories, so this hardly qualifies them as being refugees. UNRWA today has a whopping 30,000 employees, and in case you're wondering, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees serves more than 90 million people around the world with 19,000 on staff. So it's almost as if the UN is trying to say that the Palestinian issue is more important than any other problem anywhere around the world. UNRWA employees have been exposed as members of Hamas, the terrorist group that slaughtered 1,400 Israelis in cold blood on October 7th. This might explain how UNRWA's educational materials refer to Israel as the enemy, teach math by counting martyred terrorists, and include the phrase jihad as one of the doors to paradise in grammar lessons. Now, of course, there are some that might argue that right now is the wrong time to criticize UNRWA, given that there is an actual refugee crisis that is going on in Gaza right now. So let me be clear. Criticizing UNRWA need not ignore the needs of destitute Palestinians or those in crisis, and it need not ignore the intentions of well-meaning relief workers, some of whom have died during the current Gaza conflict. UNRWA may yet have an important role to play in this crisis, but UNRWA must begin to acknowledge its serious problems, and it must begin to enact meaningful reform. The agency, however, continues to deny its dysfunction. In fact, UNRWA has an office, I believe, right here on K Street that tries to convince legislators such as yourselves that it is doing a great job. If you ask me, this sounds like a lobby. So now what? Congress has some hard work ahead. The first step is to actually apply refugee status to only people who were refugees from 1948 and 1949. This would right-size UNRWA's mission right off the bat. From there, an impartial board of directors must be installed to conduct effective oversight. UNRWA actually doesn't have one. They don't have oversight of themselves. After that, there should be a full screening of UNRWA employees for terrorist affiliations. We know there are many. Then, educational material must be scrubbed of anti-Semitism and incitement against Israel. We've heard already that our friends from Impact SC are here, and they've done a great job of exposing a lot of what is in those materials. Finally, there needs to be plans for the phasing out of UNRWA over time. It may not be now, given the crisis that we're watching, but there needs to be a plan for handing off the mission of UNRWA to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. There should only be one agency that deals with refugees worldwide. The Palestinian one has failed. I should also just note that I think that shutting down that DC office might also be a good idea. Before I conclude, I would like to add a few words about the UN International Forces in Lebanon, otherwise known as UNIFIL. The agency's mandate, as you probably know, is preventing non-state actors from acquiring weapons in Lebanon. Yet it did nothing for 17 years while the Iran-backed Hezbollah amassed an arsenal of some 200,000 rockets, as well as precision-guided munitions, lethal munitions, and drones. Since October 8th, the day after the massacre in southern Israel, Hezbollah has fired more than a dozen anti-tank missiles at Israel every day. A full-blown war could erupt at any moment. And I think it's fair to ask at this point whether the UN failed or whether it was a partner in the current crisis. Either way, Washington must seriously consider ending UNIFIL's mandate. Something else can be created if a mechanism for dialogue between Israel and the Hezbollah-backed government in Lebanon is needed. But change is desperately needed. I'll end here. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding this hearing. I thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Schanzer. Mr. Lincoln.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify. With your permission, I'll summarize the written testimony. I'm not here to defend every aspect of the UN system, far from it. But based on 15 years working with the UN, including in Gaza, Jerusalem, and Ramallah, also on post-conflict arrangements in 2006 after Israel's war with Hezbollah, I'm in a position to perhaps help explain the political and operational environment on the ground. To start with, of course, as many have mentioned, the scope and brutality of the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel and the kidnapping of some 240 Israelis, including children and the elderly, by Hamas has forever changed the country, its relations with the world, and brought the long-standing conflict with the Palestinians into a new era. With the war now entering new phases, Palestinian civilians in Gaza are facing a calamity of historic proportions. The UN and UNRWA in particular are not just the best placed entities to provide the urgent life-saving assistance needed on the ground, they are the only option. The numbers are no doubt familiar, but they are staggering. More than 10,000 reported killed, including more than 4,000 children, of course, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health. There are some 725,000 internally displaced persons at 149 UN facilities. These numbers grow as Israel calls on the population to flee the areas of heaviest fighting around Gaza City. Medical supplies, fuel, food, water are running low. Facilities for sewage treatment, water desalination have either been damaged, shut down, or are working at reduced capacity. In coordination with Israel, aid has started to flow from Egypt, but in insufficient quantities, according to the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Secretary Blinken and the administration have been calling for humanitarian pauses, which are the least of what is urgently required. There is no other way to ensure increased aid other than with UN and in particular UNRWA support. UNRWA is for all intents and purposes the state. It cannot be compared to any other UN agency. No other UN agency functions in that way. It plays a vital stabilizing role in the context of the fighting, and of course will do so with regard to any day after scenario. The alternative is chaos and possible systems collapse, posing a danger first and foremost for the Palestinian civilians, but clearly for Israel as well. From an operations perspective, UNRWA is considered a reliable partner for many donors and has always maintained a close and relatively trusted relationship with the Israel Defense Forces with regard to its operations. Eventually, in the context of post-conflict arrangements, there will be a need to review, and in some cases, I would even go further than what the others have said with regard to an overhaul concerning the structure, political, operational shortcomings of the United Nations and UNRWA in particular. This must include an examination of anti-Semitism and bias against Israel. But to be sure, efforts to defund UNRWA, as happened from 2018 to 2021, have failed, as the agency managed, with relative ease, to make up for the shortfall with other donors. It's hard to imagine a different result, especially in the current context. The existing agreements between the US and UNRWA need to be expanded and strengthened. In addition to the concerns about bias presented here today, many donor countries have additional concerns about UNRWA's management, accountability framework, that was raised today as well, its financial stability that need to be addressed. Replacing UNRWA with other UN agencies is unrealistic, if not impossible, due to its entirely unique operational structure and direct assistance model. Substantial change can happen only in the context of a multilateral approach between the US, European Union, Gulf states, and other donors. The more connected the post-conflict and any effort to reform the UN are to the renewal of a viable peace process, the greater the chance of success. In conclusion, the late Kofi Annan famously stated, quote, "A United Nations that fails to be at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism and other forms of racism denies its history and undermines its future. That obligation links us to the Jewish people and to the State of Israel, which rose, like the United Nations itself, from the ashes of the Holocaust." He also said, "When we seek justice for the Palestinians, as we must, let us firmly disavow anyone who tries to use that cause to incite hatred against Jews in Israel or elsewhere." Current UN leadership and parts of the system have certainly failed to grasp the magnitude of the October 7th attacks for Israel and much of the Jewish world, and in doing so have failed to live up to these standards. But despite its shortcomings, the UN is far too important an organization for the US to disengage from. This is both for the sake of Palestinians, Israelis, and the world. For now, the priority must be to support urgent relief and life-saving assistance to civilians in Gaza. There will also soon be an opportunity to make the UN a more effective organization and one that can better live up to the legacy of Kofi Annan.
Thank you. Thank you all for your testimonies. To begin the questioning, you mentioned a moment ago how Dr. Tedros has not in any way, shape, or form retracted his false statements. Just for the record, you know, I've met with Dr. Tedros when he was the Minister for Health in Ethiopia, and he often lied on behalf of Meles, who was then the head of state there, when they had cholera outbreaks. So he had a very checkered background going into that position as Director General of the World Health Organization. He got his job by way of the Chinese Communist Party in Xi Jinping. He was their candidate, and we saw that there was a great deal of disinformation, if not outright lying, when COVID broke out, as he did the work of the Xi Jinping's dictatorship in putting out a false narrative. So I'm no great fan at all. I supported the Brit who ran, who was all about reforming the WHO. But, again, these people need to be held to account when they make statements. And for him to smear Israel and not retract it, and frankly, offer a fulsome apology, again, goes to his integrity. And integrity matters. And I've been shocked at the fact that he has not come forward and said, wait, I got it wrong. Let me just correct that and apologize to the Israelis. Nothing of the sort. Just goes on to the next disinformation campaign. So if you might want to speak to that. The issue of diversion of aid. We know that so much of the aid from the European Union, and as well as from us, gets diverted by Hamas. What should have gone into infrastructure went into tunneling, and even a lot of the aid we believe that is being sent to UNRWA is diverted in other ways. It's hard to say because there's no independent accountability whatsoever. And, Mr. Lincoln, maybe you could speak to the issue of, if a UNRWA employee took a pro-Israeli position and said, we want nothing to do with anti-Semitism, what would happen to him or her should they take that position? One, they wouldn't get the job in the first place, but say they hit it. And they say, it's about time we got to tolerance and treated our Israeli and our Jewish friends with respect. What would happen to that person? Would they last the day? Would terrible things happen to them? And on the textbooks, I have met with the lobby forces. They've come around over the years for UNRWA, and they're very good at putting pretty much what we saw throughout the 80s and 90s when it came to communist dictatorships. I took on Nicholas Ceausescu in Romania and the Securitate, and every year the lobbyists in K Street would bring, because they wanted most favored nation status, and they had page after page of nice bullets of lies. And you'd look at it and say, but it worked. They kept MFN for years, most favored nation status, even though they were doing horrible things, in that case, to Christians in Romania as part of their dictatorship. My point is, a lobby firm and a lobby effort done here and elsewhere can put a gloss on the most egregious human rights abuse. So diversion, if you maybe could speak to that issue of funding. And what is taught? I've had briefings and hearings in the past. I had one witness once read from the textbooks in English, and it was not only anti-Jewish and anti-Israel, it was also anti-American. And it went page after page after page of that. They tell us that they clean up the textbooks, and we hear, you don't get a 15-year-old who is fanatically anti-Jewish and anti-Israel without starting at a very young age to inculcate that hate into that little boy and that little girl. And it works. It works. I've worked on the Charles Taylor issue. I've had hearings with the special prosecutor with regards to David Crane here in this room with what Charles Taylor did to hype up the young people to cut off arms and do horrible things. That's child abuse of the worst kind. And Hamas and the PLA does it every single day. And maybe you could clarify for the record, with regards to the content, the UN doesn't say what goes into those books, or the US or the donor nations. It comes from the PA, if I'm not mistaken. And again, that's highlighted again in the testimony in the most recent report that was put out. So I just want to underscore that. Handoff of UNHCR, you indicated, I think, Mr. Lincoln, you don't think that would happen. UNRWA is so flawed. If this was racism based on color of someone's skin, surely, and I was one of those Republicans who supported apartheid sanctions during the Reagan administration, and for a while I was pretty much alone in that position. Finally, we all came to that position. So, because that was based on racism. Well, here we have a group that is all about racism against Jewish people. Well, we got to find some other entity, it would seem to me, because reform and the falseness of the reform in the past is numbing. Also, if I could, pay to slay. If that isn't an indicator of, we have Taylor Force, an American who in 2006 was killed, with a knife. 10 others were wounded. And what does his family get as he's languishing in prison? What do they get, and all others? They get a stipend, a lot of money from the Palestinian Authority. I still, my mind boggles at how cruel that is, and that's backed by a boss who has not gotten rid of pay to slay. I mean, the UN has been silent on that one for far too long as well. So you could, maybe speak to the textbooks, and I said this yesterday in a meeting we had with the ADL. That famous song, "You've Got to Be Taught," from South Pacific, Rodgers and Hammerstein. Hatred is taught, and it's being taught with aggressiveness every single day to the youngest of Palestinians, and that is child abuse of the worst kind, because they grow up loaded for bear to kill Jews and to end the state of Israel. They don't just come by that when they're 15. They grow into it, and UNRWA is the major conduit to that. Hello. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the WHO. It is indeed shameful that Dr. Tedros has neither retracted nor deleted his false tweet accusing Israel of attacking a hospital. That is a horrific accusation, and it's false and never happened. You mentioned the role of China in the WHO. That is significant, has never been properly addressed in Geneva, where I'm based. The WHO, the previous director was also China's candidate. Literally, China was campaigning for her. She was their candidate. And they have a substantial influence, even symbolically. Two of the goodwill ambassadors of the WHO. One is James Chow, who works for Chinese state TV and is a paid propagandist of the Chinese regime. He's a WHO goodwill ambassador. During COVID, he was publishing a lot of stuff praising China's methods of dealing with COVID. So outright propaganda. We exposed him. We had 100 NGOs complain about him. Nothing happened. Another goodwill ambassador is Peng Liyuan. She is the first lady of China, the wife of Xi Jinping. She's a WHO goodwill ambassador. In 1989, she's a singer. She was serenading the perpetrators of the Tiananmen Square massacre. She's a WHO goodwill ambassador. So WHO has a lot to answer for. You spoke about UNRWA, two issues, the aid and the education. On the aid, it's hard to get information on aid being diverted, but UNRWA itself a couple weeks ago reported that both fuel and medical equipment were removed from one of their warehouses and taken by the health authorities, which is Hamas. And they deleted their tweet an hour or two later, but Haaretz reported, Haaretz is a newspaper that is extremely critical of the Netanyahu government and generally supports UNRWA. They reported that according to their sources, this theft of UN humanitarian fuel and medical equipment did happen. According to the Israel Broadcasting Authority's Channel 11, 36,000 liters of fuel were taken. That is fuel that can run a hospital for a week and a half, can run a water desalination plant for a long period, stolen by Hamas terrorism. UNRWA education. We released our report, Impact SE has their report, and they talk about graduates of UNRWA who have committed terrorist attacks. And this is over the past 20 years, and they cite numerous graduates of UNRWA schools who commit terrorist attacks. So we, as the donor states, because all of our countries, whether you're American, Canadian, Swiss, French, British, we're all paying for UNRWA. America's the largest donor. We're told that it's an investment for peace. What UNRWA never says is, of the 3,000 or so terrorists who infiltrated into Israel, how many of them were UNRWA graduates? One of them apparently had an UNRWA certificate from a vocational school that was found in Israel, and it was published on the internet, and this person had it on their person, this terrorist. So UNRWA does not reveal those statistics, but obviously they're substantial. So it's a question whether UNRWA is really educating for peace. You asked, Mr. Chairman, about what would happen if a UN official would say, I oppose anti-Semitism. Well, we've never seen it, so it's a valid question, and I hope that our colleague will answer. But unwittingly, certain things happen. A couple years ago, the director of UNRWA in Gaza, a German national by the name of Matthias Schmel, no friend of the Jewish people, no friend of Israel, someone who tolerated lots of anti-Semitism when he was head of UNRWA in Lebanon. He was interviewed on TV, and they asked him, can you tell us about Israel's attacks? This is in May 2021. Can you tell us about Israel's attacks on Gaza? And he said, yeah, but they've been very precise. They're only hitting the terrorists, and haven't been hitting us, civilians, UNRWA. And he didn't realize what he was saying, but he effectively acknowledged in very clear terms that Israel's attacks are precisely aimed at the terrorists. And Israel used his quotes and published his quotes. That the director of UNRWA confirms what we've been saying. Immediately, he became persona non grata in Gaza because he just said the truth. Wasn't trying to praise Israel, but he just said the truth. Became persona non grata. Suddenly, there were protests sprang up outside his office. He had to leave Gaza. He was fired. He had to get another job. So that is a partial answer to your question. Finally, no, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make note, when we talk about the WHO, every year during their annual conference, they devote a significant chunk of time just to excoriating Israel. This is part of their annual process. Even at the height of the pandemic, there was a full day dedicated at the WHO conference to talking about Israel, as if that had anything to do with the global pandemic. So you just get a little bit of a sense of the priorities of this particular UN agency. I would also note that right now, we all heard about the Al-Ahli hospital and the attack, or an errant rocket by the Islamic Jihad that created the explosion there. What we're not talking about yet, but what we will be talking about very soon, is the Al-Shifa hospital, which is based in Gaza City. Underneath the Al-Shifa hospital is the Hamas command center. It is several stories deep. We believe that there could be Israeli hostages held there. We believe that there is fuel that's been diverted there. We believe there are rockets down there. And of course, there is the command center that Hamas uses for whatever is left of its fighting force in Gaza right now. How is it that the WHO has not come out and condemned Hamas for what we already know exists beneath this hospital? This would be the time that the WHO should be speaking out, and it makes one wonder why it is that they exist in the first place if they can't come out and speak about something as abhorrent as that. Now, as far as diversion of aid, we are hearing right now, the best reports that I'm getting from Gaza, from Israel, is that the aid that is coming through to the south, which is what the international community has carved out, it is being diverted to the north, where Hamas's military command center is. It is happening in the underground tunnels. UNRWA has not said a thing about this. There is, and I think, as you just heard from Hillel, this is a certain amount of self-censorship, right? The story of Matthias Schmel, is that how you pronounce his name? Yeah. We remember, that he actually, he ended up having to leave Gaza. He was persona non grata. There's a lesson in there that UNRWA can't speak out about these sorts of things if they want to maintain the access, right? And so what they've done is they've prioritized the mission over the revelation of a lot of key details that I think the world needs to know about. UNRWA has to stop that self-censorship. And by the way, I can just tell you as just an anecdote, a few years ago when I went to visit the southern communities around the Gaza Strip, we actually were able to go into some of the tunnels that had already been exposed, and you could see that there were the bags of cement with the UNRWA logo littered on the floor of these tunnels. So you get a sense of where the building material may have come from. UNHCR, I do believe that this is the only way forward. I know there will be resistance to it, but the point is that for the legitimate refugees that need to get the assistance, let's work through UNHCR. For those that are destitute, for those that are in need of services that right now UNRWA is providing, let's move them over to the Palestinian Authority. Why are we still using the UN when these are basic services that any other government should be providing? It makes no sense. Why did the Palestinians have this and no other people do? The textbooks, I'm going to leave that to people who follow this a lot more closely than I do. The excuse, though, that these are textbooks that come from other places and therefore they don't have influence, that is absolutely not something that anybody should accept. What is taught comes down to the teachers, it comes down to the staff, and of course we know that many of the staff in UNRWA have an affiliation or an affinity for Hamas. That has to change.
Thank you. Just a quick maybe word on a couple of these points on the aid diversion. From 2017 to 2021, I was the manager of something called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, which was a mechanism that was created in the wake of the 2014 war, which to date was the most destructive, and Gaza, of course, pales in comparison to what's happening now. But essentially, we worked with the Palestinian Authority and with the Israeli authorities to facilitate the rebuilding after 2014. The mechanism was functional, and in fact, even after May 2021, the Israelis moved to actually try and strengthen it as part of their response. So just to say that accounted for the bulk of the reconstruction materials that came in after 2014 for the express purpose of rebuilding, and it had to do with UN doing end-use monitoring, et cetera. By no means a perfect system, but there were no complaints from the Israelis about that and about the diversion. It's understood that the cement and other materials come from other sources, including a completely unregulated and unchecked border between Egypt and Gaza that has been open since 2018, just as one example. So that's important to mention. Also, just out of interest, interestingly, and it was of great annoyance to me as an official as a UN official working with the UN Special Coordinator's Office at the time, UNRWA maintained its own mechanism, direct mechanism with the Israelis on the entry of materials. Again, not something that was raised by the Israeli security establishment as an issue. Later on, of course, as part of its these efforts that have now come under great scrutiny on the part of the Netanyahu government to try and support the economy and particularly try and engage indirectly with Hamas, there were efforts to try and support the economy. And this included creating certain economic conditions on the ground. But this came from again, from the Netanyahu government, from the Israeli government. And so there were definitely excess materials on the ground. Now, whether or not Hamas used any of this for its tunnels, whether they were able to smuggle the goods in, I have no idea myself. We were only able to account, and pretty well, for the materials that came in for the UN and internationally funded projects. Just on the employees, UNRWA needs to investigate this and act swiftly.
Suspend.
Sorry.
UNRWA investigate? How about an outside, independent-minded body? I mean, here in this place, everything is about checks and balances. So everything, House, Senate, Republican, Democrat, GAO, which does independent analysis.
To bring it all together, to combine that with the textbooks, and again, I am no expert on education curriculum. I have not worked in that in the past. UNRWA says that in cooperation with the US and other donors, it takes measures to address racism and bias. I understand that there's some skepticism here. If they are insufficient, I would imagine that a coalition of the top donors, which includes the United States, European Union, Germany, as just the top three, could influence the required changes. It's a question of political will more than anything. It needs to be done in a multilateral fashion, just because of the nature of UNRWA and the way it works. There should be no obstacles within the UN system to this.
Can you tell us how you account for young people being so anti-Jewish and anti-Israel who have gone through the UNRWA schools? Is UNRWA anti-Semitic?
I would say that you have to understand what UNRWA is. UNRWA
I know what it is.
is providing services to 70% of the population of Gaza.
Including schools.
UNRWA, I think we need to focus more on the problem, which is Hamas. UNRWA is deeply flawed. It is not Hamas.
Your view on the pay to slay?
In terms of,
PLA?
there are a host of issues that are of deep concern regarding the governance of the Palestinian Authority.
Can you condemn that? I mean, killing Jewish and Americans and committing terrorism and then getting paid for it by the government?
Again, I'm putting it just in, of course, condemn that, but you just putting it into the context of a broader necessity for reform within the Palestinian Authority, there have been many voices that are calling for this, and in particular, I would draw your attention to an article by Salam Fayyad in Foreign Affairs, former Palestinian Prime Minister, who has outlined a number of the vital reforms that are required in order to reinvigorate the Palestinian Authority if there is ever going to be any sort of future peace process or day after scenario
ask you,
that can stabilize the situation. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
If a UNRWA teacher
Yes.
were to be pro-Israel and pro, what would happen to that person? And do you know of any who show a tolerance, at least, towards Jewish people?
I don't know any UNRWA teachers, and I can't answer the question, Mr. Chairman. But I do know that any of these horrible instances that have been raised by these reports should be dealt with immediately.
Thank you, Ms. Wild.
Okay, well, I'm going to take up where you just left off. Dealt with in what manner? These horrible instances that have been outlined. Tell us.
Teachers need to be fired.
Okay. I want to go back to something that is actually beyond the scope of your testimony, Mr. Lincoln, and I apologize in advance for that, but my colleague, Ms. Manning, raised it in her, I think it was Ms. Manning, raised it in her opening remarks, and it's one that I think, thank you, by the way, for your 15 years on the ground and for the time that you spent in Gaza and the West Bank and the work that you've done. I think that that gives you a firsthand view, that it makes you a very knowledgeable witness, and we can benefit from that. But my question is, why are there still refugee camps in Gaza?
As I mentioned in my testimony, and it's a bit strange to say, but the easiest way to get rid of UNRWA and consign it to history is, of course, in the context of a negotiated two-state solution. This was certainly what the framers of the Oslo process, perhaps naively, perhaps wishfully thought when they formed this process around 30 years ago. But ultimately, it has the status of refugees has always been considered one of the final status issues related to the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. In terms of the existence of refugee camps on the ground in places like West Bank and Gaza, it's, of course, these refugee camps are actually have the appearance more of neighborhoods or towns than anything else. They've been there on the ground, as mentioned, for some 74, 75 years. But in terms of the, it's more an issue of the status of these people pending a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is, for better or for worse, the mandate that UNRWA has been given by the United Nations.
Okay, I understand that's your view. The idea that the refugees of 1948 and 1949 are continuing to be served by UNRWA, I think, is, preposterous. And so what we're talking about is successive generations of people who are essentially born into refugee status? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, you're.
Okay. And you said that 70% of the population of Gaza is provided services by UNRWA.
Around 1.5 million beneficiaries in Gaza.
So, you also made reference in answer to my question about why there are still refugee camps, which you described as neighborhoods. Fair enough, but they're neighborhoods consisting of people who are registered refugees. Yes.
Correct.
And you described it as being part of the final political process of creating peace in the Middle East, which who knows whether that will ever come. And I'm not here to argue with you by any means. You are here as our witness, but I want you to shed some light on why it is that Israel, which was willing to accept this two-state solution, is now suffering from the effects of the anti-Semitism that even you acknowledge exists in the UN and in UNRWA. And I'm just going to leave that there. You don't need to actually answer that. That's more of a rhetorical question. But I am deeply concerned about the anti-Semitism that we see in the UN and UN agencies. You speak glowingly, and I would agree with you on the role of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and his fight against anti-Semitism. You quoted his statement, which I thought was a beautiful one. But what I'd like to know from you, since you've obviously studied the UN and you've studied Secretary General Annan's shepherding of it, what can be done to eliminate that anti-Semitism as he called for so many years ago?
Thank you for the question.
It's a softball question.
Sure. No, absolutely. Leadership.
Not really.
Leadership matters in any organization. It matters at the United Nations as well. And Kofi Annan's words, although they were written some time ago, echoed very strongly throughout the system, and also set an example for the member states and for the member state bodies. It will never, the sort of dichotomy between the United Nations as both the stage and the member state bodies and the actor is one that the stage, unfortunately, is a reflection of the world and a reflection of at least opinions of states. So when we talk about these entities, for example, special rapporteurs, Human Rights Council, as Hillel and others have very, rightly and very strongly brought up some of the deep concerns about how they function. Again, when we say that these are, UN opinions, UN thoughts, or somehow UN resolutions, it's important to understand where they come from. And the leadership that was demonstrated by not just Kofi Annan, but other Secretary Generals in this regard, and Kofi Annan, of course, had no problem calling this out in a very similar way that we heard from the colleagues here today. And he lamented it not only for the anti-Semitism and for the concern that it is, but also that it brought us no closer to peace, and it ultimately did nothing for the Palestinians and their search for self-determination as well.
When is the last time the United Nations had a Secretary General who called out anti-Semitism? I'm not
you asking me?
Yeah, I'm not trying to give you a trick question. I'm just curious.
Antonio Gutierrez has made some statements to that effect. I think, definitely speaking, definitely from a historical perspective, Kofi Annan sets the standard, and then, of course, it was continued by his successor, Ban Ki-moon. You have seen similar statements, especially during visits of the current Secretary General to Israel, in which he was, of course, hosted by Prime Minister Netanyahu. I was on the ground supporting that trip, where he made some, very clear statements. I don't have them at hand. So you do hear this, but again, I think that the standard and the ability to relate it specifically to the ongoing conflict and to separate some of these issues out was definitely set by Secretary General Kofi Annan.
I'm going to ask one other area, and then I'll pass to my colleagues, but I may come back and ask some more. Obviously, your position is that we need to work to reform and improve UNRWA, not abolish it. I'd be interested to know if you have any specific thoughts about what we do to improve and reform it. I'll just end there.
Sure. I think that the best place to start with regard to UNRWA is to sort of understand that it's this creation of the General Assembly, and it's to me, the root of a number of these flaws are that it falls between the cracks with regard to accountability in general, and this is what we heard from some of the other colleagues as well. I do see the Secretariat, the Secretary General in particular, being able to take on more of a role. There's also the, and I'm sure the colleagues would have a lot to say about it, but within the Department of Peace Building and Political Affairs, there is also the Division of Palestinian Rights within. And again, with a view to clarifying accountability frameworks, who's in charge? You know, who is in charge of UNRWA? And then also with a goal to try and sharpen its humanitarian and development roles on the ground, I think would go a long way to addressing a number of the key shortcomings of the agency, including some of the issues that the colleagues raised, very real and serious issues that the colleagues raised today. In my opinion, this cannot be done bilaterally. The United States has tried both ways, either as the biggest donor to exercise the leverage in that respect, or to defund. Neither will work. It's a multilateral entity. This is the United Nations. We need to work with allies, and there is a lot of common ground. But if we do it just solely based on one particular issue or one particular set of issues, then it will likely be less successful, is my view.
Sorry, I said that was my last. I have one last. So with your focus on improving the actual humanitarian rebuilding efforts on the ground in Gaza, my question to you is, how does that get done with Hamas present?
Two sets of issues. One is I can tell you from my experience how we did it after the 2014 war. And you're hearing—
You think it's applicable now? Sure.
Yeah, because you're hearing a lot of the same things. And again, we don't know how this particular conflict is going to end. We don't know. And what will be on the ground.
Let's even talk about prior to October 7th, okay?
Okay.
So before this conflict started, UNRWA was on the ground, but not providing the focused level of humanitarian support that you think is optimal, right? And I guess my question is, so how is that supposed? Let's talk about before October 7th.
It is largely because of Hamas and because of Hamas's presence that UNRWA is actually strengthened on the ground. Because a lot of donors would prefer to give to a UN agency that has some degree of accountability rather than working with ministries that some have closer ties with Hamas than others. The problem has always been that, and we saw this, and it's applicable to the current context and as a lesson learned for the future. After 2014, you saw a reinvigorated sense from the Palestinian Authority that they were going to play a role in the reconstruction on the ground. This was what the Gaza reconstruction mechanism was all about, and this was what the political efforts were. Because of Hamas's existence, continued existence on the ground, and because of its own internal divisions and its own political problems within the Palestinian body politic, between the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas de facto government in Gaza, it broke down. And the engagement of the Palestinian Authority wavered over time because they felt that it was working too much to support, not to support necessarily, but to take Hamas, the Hamas government, off the hook with regard to governance.
I'll stop you there. Mr. Schanzer, you want to
Yeah, look, I want to just point out something, and it should be obvious, but maybe it isn't. UNRWA helped perpetuate Hamas rule, starting in 2007 when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force in a brutal civil war in which they toppled the Palestinian Authority. Hamas has been the sovereign, basically, for 16 years. It failed to provide basic services to its own people because, surprise, terrorist groups don't care about providing basic services.
Mr. Lincoln,
but
do you disagree with what he just said? Sorry.
It's not just UNRWA. It's
No, what he just specifically said. Do you disagree with that?
that terrorist groups are not interested.
No, it's before that. What,
That UNRWA helped perpetuate Hamas rule.
that.
I don't think that that's completely accurate. I think it's far more nuanced.
Okay. I'm going to yield to my colleague, Mr. Schneider.
I'll yield to him. And frankly, we'll go to a member of the committee, Ms. Banning.
Thank you. I was going to say.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lincoln, UNRWA is meant to provide certain basic services to the population that it serves, such as education and health care. However, in meetings with members and staff, some UNRWA officials seem to believe that they are there to perpetuate the right of return. In your view, what is the proper role of UNRWA?
UNRWA is not there to perpetuate the right of return. If some of the individuals are from the organization are stating so, then that's not correct. Of course, there has been over time a politicization of its mandate, exactly as you have laid out. And again, this is something that has been perpetuated through the Palestinian Authority's textbooks and other means.
So what should we be doing to focus UNRWA on what its mandate is and not what its mandate should not be?
As I laid out in my testimony, I believe that a multilateral effort towards looking at the shortcomings of the United Nations with regard to this conflict in general, which includes UNRWA, is required. I think that also just on a broader sense, there are many other issues. The current iteration of the United Nations on the ground stems back from the Oslo peace process from 1993 and 1994. There are aspects of it that no longer make sense.
So let me go a step further. How would you assess UNRWA, UNESCO, the UN Human Rights Council, other agencies in terms of their fidelity to the UN's own principles of neutrality and tolerance?
I'm not familiar with all of them. We're talking about some actors on the ground, some member state bodies whose positions are defined by states, like UNESCO. So it's a little bit difficult to compare all of those together. The problem, as I mentioned, and I think that, again, we're talking about a somewhat of a systemic problem, is that in 1994, there was a division of responsibility, more or less, for the peace process. The United States was in charge of the negotiations. The European Union and others, including the United Nations, were asked by the parties and the United States to engage on the ground and support the development of Palestinian institutions and support the Palestinian people. Now, with a peace process collapsed, especially in light of the current conflict, the United Nations has the appearance less of a conflict resolution mechanism and more of an advocate, perhaps, of one side. This needs to be updated because of the situation. But again, if and when, and you hear this also from the administration on the need to reinvigorate a peace process in the wake of all of this horrible carnage that we see on the ground, you can better believe that the UN will be asked to play a role. What role that is, whether it's a circumscribed role, whether it's a greater role or not, of course, depends on a number of factors, including how the war continues and how it ends.
So there were remarks that were made by a Hamas political wing leader that were shown on TV, on the news, where he stated that it was the responsibility of Hamas to fight against Israel and to protect its fighters with their underground tunnels. And in response to questions, he said that they did not have a responsibility to allow the people, the Palestinian people, to get shelter from attacks in those tunnels, that the responsibility of the Palestinian people was solely held by the United Nations. Can you comment on that? And can you also help us understand, has there ever been a comprehensive review of the population that UNRWA serves to identify how many people actually meet the UN High Commissioner for Refugees' definition of a refugee?
Just on your last point, I'm not familiar with that aspect, and again, I should clarify for the committee, I'm not and have not ever been a staff member of UNRWA. I worked for a different part of the UN, but I will say that the comment that you mentioned from the I believe it was Musa Abu Marzouk from Hamas. This is a very common perception. Held not just by Hamas, but by Palestinian political bodies in general. And it's primarily a misunderstanding of the UN's role on the ground. Of course, there are a number of UN agencies that operate similar to how UN agencies operate anywhere in the world that support systems on the ground to provide services to the population. And in the West Bank and Gaza, you have 22 of them. UNRWA is a little bit different. And I think that, again, if we go to the heart of it, UNRWA's mode of operation and its sort of direct service model is what sets it apart, and in some ways is what is at the root of some of the issues that a wide array of donors have been concerned with for many years.
So you would agree that the comment made by that Hamas leader of the political wing is wrong, that it is the responsibility of the elected government to take care of the Palestinian people who live in Gaza?
That's correct. Of course, in a context like Gaza, and as in many other places in the world, the work of UN agencies is often conflated with the work of governments.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Schanzer, what are the best ways we can now support targeted humanitarian assistance to make sure that it gets to the people of Gaza who are actually the victims of Hamas?
It's a good question. During the war itself, what we have right now is the southern part of the Gaza Strip, which has been sort of cordoned off. The problem right now is diversion from the south to the north. Unfortunately, there's probably going to need to be some sort of military solution to destroy those tunnels so that the aid stays in the south and doesn't get diverted to Hamas in the north. I don't know how else to do it because UNRWA is not stopping it, and nor are the people on the ground. So there is a huge problem. I think I can't even tell you what the percentage is of the goods that are coming through that are being passed underground to the north, but it's a serious problem.
And does UNRWA have the ability to stop the confiscation of those goods by Hamas?
This is what we were talking about. I mean, first of all, you don't see people walking around sort of armed, right? From UNRWA, they're not there to confront anybody. That's not their job, right? Their job is to just simply provide services to the people that they deem to be qualified as Palestinian refugees, which of course has ballooned beyond any reasonable expectation. But the question really is whether UNRWA can speak out about it. And again, I mentioned this during the prepared remarks. There is a tendency among UNRWA staff to want to sweep these sorts of things under the rug in order to continue their mission. So in other words, in order to continue to provide the goods and services that they want to provide to the people of Gaza, they will pretend not to see these sorts of crimes taking place, and this makes UNRWA complicit in everything that Hamas is doing, and that is why it needs to be dismantled.
Mr. Neuer, what has the UN done to condemn Hamas and call for the release of the 240 hostages, including citizens of dozens of countries? These are not just Israelis, these are not just Americans, these are citizens of dozens of countries. What has the UN done to condemn that, to call for the release of the hostages, and frankly, to work for the release of the hostages?
Thank you, Member of Congress. I have heard a number of UN statements that have condemned Hamas's actions, but these really have been the tiny minority, and they have not had the vigor and prominence and energy that the UN's other statements on the situation have had. So there have been certain statements, but they really have been the tiny minority. The bulk of their statements, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, have been focused at pointing the finger at Israel, expressly or by implication. Certainly the UN has tremendous ability and leverage to press for the release of the hostages. The Secretary General has a bully pulpit. The other UN agencies are present on the ground in Gaza and in the territories. So they actually have enormous opportunity to speak out, to press Hamas, and it has certainly not been their priority. So one can find statements here and there, including by Dr. Tedros, but sometimes they were only in reaction when they were criticized by Israel for not having spoken out. So I certainly think UN leaders, including Guterres, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, who should be in the region now, should be taking much more significant action if they've been doing anything to see that the hostages are released.
Mr. Lincoln.
No, thank you. Just to respond, although some of his statements might leave a little bit to be desired, Secretary General Guterres, I think in every single one of his statements has mentioned the hostages, not just mentioned the hostages, but called for their immediate and unconditional release. And he used the word now repeatedly in his last statement. So
and are there additional steps he could be taking?
With regard to those steps, again, the United Nations envoy, the special coordinator, the office that I used to work for, is engaged, I don't know to what degree, in the sort of broader discussions that are taking place with the U.S. administration, Qatar, and others on the ground. But from what I understand, and again, I don't, just am getting information from press reports like everybody else. Again, the UN is playing, that supporting role, but to what degree?
He hasn't put together a task force or called special meetings or emergency sessions to discuss the freeing of the hostages.
I have not heard of that, but I imagine that the U.S. is firmly in the lead on this issue right now.
Mr. Chairman, if you would indulge me for one more question. Thank you. Mr. Neuer, like many on this panel, I strongly support the Abraham Accords. In fact, we have the father of the Abraham Accord, or the father of the Abraham Accords caucus with us, one of them, with us today. And we all believe that this could be transformative for the region. Since they were signed, has there been any positive movement in terms of the voting patterns of these countries that are part of the Abraham Accords or in their approach toward Israel at the UN?
Thank you. It's a question I get often asked by different audiences, a very important question. I would say in terms of voting, the Abraham Accords countries such as Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, have for the most part not changed their voting. With one exception, a year or two ago, Bahrain was absent during a vote against Israel, and the Palestinians were upset about that, and I think summoned the Bahraini ambassador to complain about that. So that was maybe one instance. But in general, we have not seen voting changes, and these countries vote with the Arab world consistently against Israel, which is unfortunate. However, there have been a number of instances that are less than voting, but which are significant actions that have showed a change of tone. I will speak from my experience in Geneva. At least once, and I believe already twice, there have been statements made, for example, by the Deputy Ambassador of the United Arab Emirates, who took the floor at the UN in Geneva to give a statement on behalf of all the Abraham Accords countries, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, America, and Israel, a joint statement dealing with some technical matters, but that was something that for me was unprecedented, to see an Arab country take the floor and give a joint statement with Israel on something positive, which was a very welcome development. So there have been a few statements and other atmospherics, I would say, both in New York and Geneva, and certainly bilaterally those countries have improved their approach toward Israel in various other meetings and so forth.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And thank you to all of our witnesses today.
I yield to my good friend and colleague, Brad Stutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and your patience throughout this hearing. Maybe to just demonstrate that I paid attention in Sunday school, but also to make a historical point, because I do want to talk about history. In synagogues around the world this week, two things are going to be universal. On the one hand, there are going to be armed guards outside every one of those synagogues for fear of anti-Semitism and violence. We saw it in Pittsburgh in a horrific attack that killed people as they prayed, but we're now seeing it around the world, and you're going to have that security, and that's part of what we're talking about here. But inside those synagogues, every single one, they're going to be reading from the Torah. And the Torah portion they'll be reading from is Chayei Sarah. And it's an ironically named section of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, because Chayei Sarah means the life of Sarah. But it starts with the death of Sarah. And why it's interesting in the context of this hearing, upon Sarah, the wife of Abraham, dying, Abraham buys, in the Torah, tells the story of Abraham buying a place to bury his wife. Mr. Neuer, you're nodding your head, so I think I can answer this question. Where is that place?
It's in Hebrew called the Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron. And it's indeed, I read the Torah last week in advance of this week during Mincha on Shabbat, and saw how lengthy that portion is described when Abraham purchases that portion of land in Hebron.
There was a deed. That's not what I'm here to go through. My point I want to make is that the Jews have connection to this land. Hebron, for those who aren't aware, is a city in the West Bank. Jews lived in that city from the time of Abraham until 1929. I don't know, does anyone want to answer what happened in 1929, Mr. Schanzer?
Pogrom.
Pogrom. Arabs massacred the Jews of Hebron. Those that weren't killed left. We can talk about all those things. I'm not using it to make one side or the other. My point is that Jews have lived in the land of Israel for 3,000 years. And I think that's an important thing to note. These are not colonialists who came from Europe. In fact, today, many of the Jews, the majority of Jews who live in Israel, can trace their roots not to Europe, but to countries like Libya and Iraq, Yemen, other places. But they have a connection that dates back 3,000 years. I could go through the history, talk 1917. If I say that, we're talking about the Balfour Declaration. I can talk about 1947, and why don't I pause there for a second? Because in November 1947, Mr. Lincoln worked at the UN. What happened in November 1947?
General Assembly passed Resolution 181.
Which General Assembly?
The UN General Assembly.
The United Nations General Assembly, partitioning the land for a Jewish state and an Arab state. And what happened was the Jews of the time, though that state did not include Jerusalem, did not include Hebron, the Jews said yes, and the Arabs said no. So jump ahead a few months, May 15th, 1948, Jews declared their state when the British left and turned over the mandate. That is the state of Israel. Palestinians who were offered a state instead declared war. There's a pattern here that I'm going to get to in a second. The war that ensued, that proceeded over the years 1947 to 1949, defined what we consider the borders of Israel today, an armistice line. In 1956, there was another war. Israel occupied territory and returned that territory. In 1967, importantly, there was another war between Israel, Egypt, Syria. Israelis said to King Hussein of Jordan, please don't attack. If you don't attack us, we won't attack you. But King Hussein felt the pressure from the Arab world and attacked. The outcome of that was Israel control over the West Bank and Gaza. It's important to get us to where we are today. But there was a conference of the Arab League in Khartoum, famous for 3 responses. Mr. Schanzer, you're shaking your head, so I'll turn it to you. What were the 3 responses?
They were the 3 no's: no recognition, no diplomacy, no peace.
Israel offered to return the West Bank and Gaza, and the Arabs said no. Not once, but 3 times. I remember very well when Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem, made peace with Israel, a peace that stands today. I remember September of 1993 when Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn. A year later, Israel signed a peace agreement with Jordan. My colleague talked about, we had the Abraham Accords. Abraham Accords, which for the first time, and I've been talking about this a lot, and these aren't my words, the words of Tal Becker, one of the negotiators, said the Abraham Accords recognize that both Israelis, or both Jews and Arabs, belong to the same land. Jews going back thousands of years, Arabs going back thousands of years. They belong to this land. And what the Abraham Accords recognize is that by embracing each other, by recognizing the humanity and the connection that both have to the same place, both can elevate the place and their peoples. And that's what the Abraham Accords were about. And that's what was happening as Israel was making progress with Saudi Arabia. And there were certain groups and states that said, no, we can't do this, namely Iran and its proxies. The attack on October 7th, the heinous attack on October 7th, had as much to do about scuttling the progress being made with Saudi Arabia as anything else. And that's why it's so depressing to me that the UN has been virtually absent in its role. And Mr. Lincoln, you've talked about this. The UN could be doing so much, but it has failed to step up at a time of great need. If I come back to what we're talking about, we've said here, Mr. Lincoln, you said UNRWA is the only option. My colleague, Ms. Wild, asked, why are there refugee camps in Gaza? I asked the same question. Why are there refugee camps in Gaza? Israel didn't occupy Gaza in 1948. Egypt did. And yet the Palestinians were left to be in squalor in camps. Israel controlled Gaza from 1967, not until October of 2023, but until August of 2005. In August of 2005, Israel left, not leaving a single soldier or civilian inside Gaza, and turned complete control over to the Palestinian Authority. And Mr. Schanzer, you pointed out very clearly in a civil war, a brutal civil war in which people were thrown off of buildings and executed in front of their families. Hamas took over Gaza, and those that weren't killed from Fatah left to go to the West Bank. But since 2007, when Hamas took over, Israel hasn't controlled Gaza, Egypt hasn't controlled Gaza, the UN hasn't controlled Gaza, and yet there are still refugee camps. I think the number I saw is 1.7 million of the 2.2 million people who live in Gaza are considered refugees. How is that possible in a place controlled by first the Palestinian Authority and then Hamas since 2005, that these people are still refugees? I think that is the question we have. And Mr. Schanzer, you said it very well. Hamas is empowered by the fecklessness of UNRWA. I think UNRWA has to go. But I think the work UNRWA is charged to do has to be done. So I'm not calling for the immediate elimination of UNRWA. What I'm saying is let's find people who are willing to do the necessary work to help and lift up the people of Gaza, to take them out of the squalor of refugee camps, to put them into cities and communities with schools, hospitals, playgrounds, jobs that will give them the same thing we want for all of our kids. So, Mr. Neuer, I'll ask you, what's it going to take to make sure that the services UNRWA is supposed to be providing get provided in a way that doesn't threaten Israel and lifts up the Palestinian people?
Thank you. I think that, well, first, I agree with everything that you just said. And one of the challenges is that although my colleague, Mr. Lincoln, said that UNRWA is not meant to promote the right of return, that is certainly not what the entire spectrum of Palestinian factions believe. They have said continuously that they see UNRWA as having a political purpose. So while the UN says it's a humanitarian agency, for the Palestinians, it's a political purpose, and it's to sustain their grievance. And there have been Israelis who thought, and I mean the Israeli establishment, who thought that UNRWA was a solution because it provided short-term stability. But when the message of UNRWA is indeed returned, that all the Palestinians will go back to undo Israel. And I think what we saw on October 7th was, if we thought that UNRWA was providing short-term stability, it seems very likely to have promoted the idea that when Palestinians get aid, whether it's cement, they're not going to build the playgrounds that you mentioned, the homes, the hospitals and schools in Gaza, because that's not their home. What they're told, and we saw it with the 3,000 terrorists who infiltrated to Israel, they've been told that their home is in Tel Aviv, in Jaffa, in Haifa, and so forth, going back to 1948 to undo Israel. So I think there is a core problem with UNRWA. The Palestinians see it as something that sustains their political grievances, and on October 7th, I think we saw what it leads to. How we're going to make change on the ground going forward to see that aid will not get diverted, I do not have the answer. I think we're going to have to see what the situation looks like. Obviously, the Palestinian Authority is being mentioned. Let's not forget that Abbas, just about a month ago, maybe a bit more, was condemned by the international community for justifying Hitler. So the PA is no great solution, but Israel may have to pick between several bad solutions. So we're going to have to wait to see what happens on the ground. But I don't know how we're going to prevent aid from being diverted, certainly as long as Hamas is alive and functioning.
Mr. Lincoln, you mentioned Salam Fayyad. Before I asked you what he did before, what's he doing now?
Don't know.
He's a professor at Princeton.
Okay, he's a professor. Yeah.
You mentioned the name Salam Fayyad, and many of us who have been around this place for a long time will start nodding our head. Many of the people who have been watching the situation in Israel are start nodding our head. What was Mr. Fayyad's position in the PA?
Prime Minister.
He was the Prime Minister of the PA. What did he focus on during his time as Prime Minister?
Institutional reform.
Creating the institutions of democracy and governance that would lift up the Palestinian people. What happened?
He left after he was more or less pushed out by President Abbas.
He was pushed out, and that is the challenge we face. So, Mr. Neuer, you talk about the PA, which I believe, if we're going to see a future, it has to be one that involves the PA in Gaza. Abbas is a problem. There's two Abbases, right? Mahmoud Abbas is a problem. Mansour Abbas, the Israeli Abbas, is a hero. Thank you. If you've watched what he has said and the courage he has demonstrated, the moral clarity that he has demonstrated, and by the way, Mansour Abbas is an Israeli Arab who identifies with the Islamist movement, but believes that Jews and Arabs can live together, Jews and Muslims can live together. And I believe that too. I have spent my entire life focusing on ways to find peace and looking for stories. This is where I'm coming to you, Mr. Schanzer, and stories that may challenge some of our assumptions. So you wrote about a personal experience this summer. I hope your leg is better, but you hurt your leg. You had to go to the hospital in Israel. Do you want to share a little bit about that story?
Sure. Thank you. My leg is doing much better. Not 100% better, but better. The story is that I had been traveling. I was tired. I was jet lagged, and I took a bad fall and broke my leg. Had to go to Shaare Zedek Hospital on a Friday night. And 5 out of 6 of my doctors were Israeli Arabs, and they were incredible people, incredibly warm people, incredibly professional people. I still to this day believe that they said it 100% the way it was supposed to. That's how I've been able to make the progress that I have. But actually what was even more remarkable after that, I went back to my hotel that night, and when I checked out of the hospital, they didn't have crutches. They just don't give out crutches at Israeli hospitals. I never knew that before, never had a reason to know that before.
Walk it off.
Yeah, it's just, well, actually the nurse told me just go ahead and hop, which was kind of remarkable. But at any rate, I woke up the next morning in a bit of a panic because I needed to get home. And so I asked the people downstairs at the front desk if they could get me crutches, and they said they couldn't. They didn't know what to do because it was Shabbat in Jerusalem where nothing is open. So after hitting a few brick walls, I called a friend of mine in East Jerusalem, an Israeli Arab, and he called a friend in Ramallah. And his friend walked into a pharmacy, bought my crutches, took them through, I'm guessing, 4 or 5 checkpoints in the West Bank, and dropped them off to me so that I could get on a plane and go home. And that episode taught me a lot about the people-to-people connections that I think is really what we probably need to be focusing on right now. There's obviously a lot of terrible news out there about the Israeli military and Hamas and Iran and all of the actors that have thrust the Middle East into really a terrible crisis. But at the end of the day, if this is ever going to start to work, we're going to need those people-to-people contacts.
And I'm going to close with another story. We need to keep the hostages in our mind and call for the immediate unconditional release of every one of those hostages. One of those who has a Chicago connection is Hirsch Goldberg Poland. Hirsch's story is he was at the concert. He fled the concert and ended up taking shelter in a bus stop, which is in Israel, bus stops are bomb shelters. And there were about 40 young people in this bus stop when the terrorists came. And with them was a Bedouin, happened to be taking shelter as well in this. And as the story is related by Hirsch's mother, Rachel Goldberg, at the UN, by the way. And if you haven't seen it, I commend the speech she gave at the UN. She tells a story about this Bedouin who steps out and says, "It's all my family in here." Doesn't know these people, doesn't know who they are, just knows that they are in danger. And this Muslim sees these people as his brother or family and says, "This is my family, we're okay." And the terrorists then, as Rachel tells the story, proceeded to beat this person. Don't know what happened to him, if he survived or was killed, threw grenades into the bus stop. Most of the people were killed. Hirsch lost his arm, was able to tie off a tourniquet, and has been taken hostage into Gaza. I am one of the founders of the bipartisan bicameral Abraham Accords Caucus. If you look at my record, I have spent much of my time in Congress and long years before that striving for peace between Israelis and their Palestinian neighbors and the broader region. I believe it is possible. I believe that we need to see the humanity of the people in Israel, the people in Gaza, the West Bank, and the entire region. War puts civilians at the center. War is the victims. Through the course of the past month, one of the things that was reminded me was a scene from MASH. It was my favorite TV show. And Hawkeye made the comment, war isn't hell, war is war, and hell is hell. He was asked, well, what do you mean by that? He says, in hell, there are only sinners. But in war, it's the innocent people. The people who want nothing but to live, to raise their children, to look to a future, who have no voice in deciding whether or not Hamas was going to violate an 870-day-old ceasefire with a horrific massacre of 1,400 innocent people in Israel, and holding the population of Gaza as human shields as Israel does what it must to secure its border and rescue its hostages. Mr. Schanzer, thank you for your story, because what we know is that good people striving for peace can find a way to help each other, to go through difficult challenges in the pursuit of making a difference in someone else's lives. I pray we get to a peace in Gaza as soon as possible. But there will be no peace as long as Hamas holds 240 people hostage. No peace as long as Hamas continues to see over the population of Gaza as they have since 2007. And no peace as long as Hamas is able to threaten Israel with their vision of the destruction of the state and the murder of Jewish people. We need the UN to step up. Mr. Chair, thank you for having this hearing and making sure we can get this message out. Madeleine Albright said a long time ago, I heard her say it, is, as bad as the UN is, I can only imagine how much worse the world would be without it. I pray we can replace UNRWA with groups, governments, people who can do the important work and can stand up to the terrorists and the people who are holding the Palestinian people back. With that, I yield.
Thank you. Thank you, Brad, so very much. Let me just ask a couple of final questions, and then thank you for your time, but above all for your expertise and leadership. The first, and I mentioned this earlier about the Washington Free Beacon story, and you mentioned Francesco Albanese as well, an article by Charles Hillel, and he points out, I should say, that this special rapporteur for Palestinian territories has said Israel has no right to self-defense, and talks about how it's contrary to Article 51. It doesn't include the right to defend itself against Hamas. And without objection, I would ask that this article be made a part of the record, because it just highlights, you're supposed to just sit there and allow people to be slaughtered without taking an effort to counter it, which is what Israel is doing. So I'm wondering how all three of you might respond to Albanese's, what I think is a very, very horrible statement that she has made. Secondly, I remember when Yasser Arafat was discovered that he had hoarded all kinds of finances, monies. The IMF even found that he had $900 million that had been donated. He put into his own bank accounts between the year 1995 and 2002. And now we find, and I would ask, I was consent without objection, that this article, Hamas' top 3 leaders are worth a staggering $11 billion. Now, at a time, as Brad said, and others have said, and I'm saying it too, people are living in squalor and poverty at or below poverty level in Gaza. How is it that these 3 individuals are worth a staggering $11 billion? Why isn't that money being conveyed to the people in Gaza and elsewhere, other Palestinians? Your thoughts on that? Because I think that's outrageous. And again, it follows the line of Arafat. I mean, when that came out about him, I didn't expect that. I didn't like a lot of his policies, but I never thought he was hoarding money and making money from donations that were coming in. Let me ask you again, do UNRWA schools, Mr. Lincoln, if you could answer this, do they promote violence against Jews? Do UNRWA schools promote violence against Jews? I remember when Ms. Safran years ago brought to my attention a pep rally that had been held where UNRWA teachers, like we do a football game and have a pep rally, they were celebrating suicide bombers and applauding and very loudly. The students are all getting worked up about putting on the vest to kill Jews. I was appalled by it. Your thoughts on that, if you would. And then finally, I'm going to request another GAO report. And I know we'll get a number of members in a bipartisan way to join me in it. There was one done in 2018, 2019. It did not get to the point. I mean, state kept information that they did not share about the textbooks, for example. And that was disappointing. I think there has to be absolute transparency, even what our own government in the United States knows about this. But even the UN, there was concerns about what was raised as well. So we'll be asking for that. And I do want to, again, thank, I only did it very quickly before. You know, I'm the author of the bill that established the HR 221, the Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism. Deborah Lipstadt now is a leader as the ambassador at large. But Rob Davidson, who's sitting right there, that bill with 87 co-sponsors, and Brad, who just left, was one of the co-sponsors as well, that languished for almost 2 years in the Senate. We could not get it out. He got it out, so I want to thank him publicly at this hearing for doing that, because I was frustrated, we all were, all the co-sponsors beyond words, that it was being held up in the Senate. So thank you, Rob, for doing that. But on those questions, if you could. Yes, Mr. Lincoln.
Thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps on the special rapporteur, problematic and unhelpful, to say the least. Again, this is part of a general dysfunction that you see with regard to this conflict that I think that is something that, again, in the context of a renewed, maybe reinvigorated approach to the United Nations that can be dealt with. But again, these are the comments of a special rapporteur coming from the Human Rights Council. So I think we just need to narrow down on the root of that problem. These are not the statements of an official from the UN Secretariat, for example. So we just need to put that into context.
But it is the UN system, and
it's member states appointed. I think we need to get to the root of it. We have a diplomatic service. We have a State Department that needs to engage with the different entities that are making these votes and making these appointments.
See, I think that's a distinction without a difference when you talk about, I mean, when the average person and even somebody who's very well acquainted with all this hears that, that becomes like, you know, that's coming out of, she's a special rapporteur.
No, of course.
And from human rights, I mean, that, to me, that's appalling that she would say that.
The article on Hamas, I'm not aware of it. I would interested to read it. It's very shocking. I share your sentiments. In terms of, again, on the education curriculum, I'm not an expert. I know nothing of the education curriculum. I do know that this is a decades-long discussion that we've been having here, and I have suggested that through a multilateral engagement, again, with the top donors of UNRWA, that a concerted effort on changing these textbooks, to me, would seem possible.
And I would say,
it seems we've never tried that.
You have to have people to monitor the classrooms, because the teachers themselves are so full of hate towards Jews that even if you had the right textbooks, it would be conveyed. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just address two things that you put into that multifaceted question. Maybe it's just instructive to just read a small passage from my written testimony about Francesca Albanese. She blamed Israel for a Palestinian terrorist attack that left 6 Israelis and 1 Ukrainian dead in February of 2023. In July, she released a report where she dismissed Israeli security needs, called for punitive actions against Israel, and justified terrorism against Israelis. And this, of course, won the praise of Hamas. She wrote that Palestinians continuously rebel against their prison wardens, and she justified the October 7th attack, framing it as a response to Israeli aggression. I could go on, but the point is that we knew her ideology before she was appointed to this position. And she has said back in 2014 that she believed that the United States was, quote, subjugated by the Jewish lobby, end quote. This is the person that was just named and is in this position of power. She needs to be removed. And I think, yes, 100%, there's no reason to keep her. I don't care what the process was of getting her into that chair. She needs to be moved out of it. Now, as for the $11 billion, I've seen a lot of reports on this. I'm a former terrorism finance tracker. That number has gone up significantly over the years. For a while, it was at the tens of millions, and then it was hundreds of millions, and now we're up to billions. The key to all of that, if you want to know how these guys even maintain bank accounts, they live in Qatar, a major non-NATO ally that has a huge amount of lobby power that they deploy here on Capitol Hill. The Qataris have been exposed during this most recent conflict. We can see them for exactly who they are. They try to play arsonist and firefighter. They host a large headquarters of Hamas in their country, and now they're trying to work with the United States and use their good offices to try to get the hostages released. I don't buy it for a minute. They are part of the Hamas axis, and they need to be called out. I would even suggest here that they be stripped of their major non-NATO ally status here in the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Concerning Francesca Albanese, I certainly agree that she needs to be removed. She is in violation of the UN Human Rights Council's own code of conduct regarding special rapporteurs. They're meant to be impartial and objective, and she is nothing of the sort. She's even acknowledged it at various points. Now, it was said by my colleague on the panel that she's not a member of the Secretariat. She's appointed by the Council. And that may be true. Certainly, I believe she should be removed. But the problem that she demonstrates is also found, regrettably, within the Secretariat itself. I mentioned in my remarks the case of Craig Mohiber, who is based in New York, but had been previously in Geneva and previously also worked for the Secretariat in Gaza. He's someone on his social media accounts who was supposed to be a neutral UN official. That's his solemn commitment. Repeatedly accused Israel of apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, you name it, portrayed Israel as evil. He was a leading member of the UN Secretariat in New York. And in addition, I would say that in the current conflict, we're seeing members of the Secretariat based in East Jerusalem, based in Gaza, who are extremely partisan. I've spoken with members of UN Secretariat who are appalled to see how many of their colleagues are not neutral in the slightest, people who've been in other duty stations who did not see the same kind of levels of partisanship, and that is something that needs to be investigated. Finally, I would say that UN officials, regarding whether Israel has the right to self-defense, Albanese said Israel does not have the right to self-defense. We've seen repeatedly how certain UN officials have created a separate interpretation of international law for Israel. There's international law, how it works for the world and then for Israel. And the notion that Israel does not have a right to defend itself from a Hamas massacre of thousands of its own people is absurd. And likewise, we saw for many years that after Israel left, Israel took out every one of its soldiers, every one of its civilians from Gaza. They were still accused of occupying Gaza, which again is absurd. This happened in no other place in the world. So there's like a special international law that's used just to target Israel. And we've seen UN officials recently, the Secretary General, it is true that he has spoken out on the hostages, but if you look at his statements that are seen by millions, on his tweets, on his Instagram posts, his social media, the vast majority, if not all of them, are focused on Palestinian suffering, where Israel is blamed expressly or by implication. The statements about the hostages, which he has made, do not get by far equal amount of prominence. It's not where his emotional energy is invested. And what we do see is that UN officials have repeatedly said, yes, 1,400 people were massacred by Hamas, but now thousands of Palestinians are killed. And that argument was made before. It was made actually in the Nuremberg trials, when the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi death squads that moved around in Europe and killed 1 million Jews and 1 million others, when they were brought to justice at Nuremberg, they said one of their arguments was the Dresden defense. Say, yes, we may have done these killings, but you, the Allies, you killed civilians when you bombed Dresden and other cities. And that was wholly rejected by the Nuremberg court. The notion that, which this Nazi defendant was trying to make, that the deliberate and purposeful killing of civilians was equal to the taking of civilian lives that is undesired, unintended, and unavoidable, was absolutely rejected. Those are completely two different things. And that is the essence of civilization, is to distinguish between those two. And sadly, at the United Nations, we are seeing this scandalous Dresden defense being brought up again and again to equate the purposeful, deliberate killing of civilians, which is a crime, to equate it with taking of civilian lives, as I said, that is undesired, unintended, but unavoidable. That should be rejected completely.
Thank you very much. Just one final question to you, Mr. Lincoln. You heard Dr. Schanzer and Hillel Neuer say that Francesco Albanese ought to be fired. Do you agree?
As I said, I found her statements deeply problematic. And so, you know, if this was, you know, again, it comes to the question of accountability. So I don't even know how you go about firing. You would have to ask the Human Rights Council to do that.
But if you had the ability to
If
do
I
it.
had the ability, yes, absolutely.
Thank you so
I would.
much. Anything else you'd like to add before we close? Thank you so very, very much. And thank you for this time commitment you've given, which you do all the time, but for the sake of our subcommittee. This hearing is adjourned.